Imagine being 32 years old, exactly 7 months pregnant, and standing in your custom marble kitchen. You look down at the island counter, and your billionaire husband has left a manila folder perfectly squared next to a bowl of apples. It's not a trust fund document. It is a legal petition for a mandatory prenatal paternity test. He accuses you of a devastating affair. He admits to having private investigators follow your every move. He looks you dead in the eye and threatens to freeze your accounts, lock you out of the house, and utterly destroy your reputation by midnight if you don't give the clinic your blood. But here is the most twisted part. He doesn't actually think you cheated. He is terrified of what the genetic test will reveal about his own DNA. What happens when a pregnant wife realizes her perfect marriage is just a velvet cage hiding a $500,000 extortion plot? She doesn't just cry. She doesn't beg. She tracks down her husband's secret mistress, and together, they completely dismantle a billionaire's empire. The true value of this story isn't just about the thrill of revenge, it's a masterclass in recognizing psychological manipulation, finding your undeniable inner power when you are pushed to the brink, and realizing that sometimes the cage door was unlocked the entire time. If you love stories where the underdog strikes back with absolute brilliance, make sure to gently tap that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know down in the comments, what would you have done in Clara's shoes? Share this video with anyone who needs a powerful reminder of their own strength. Now let's dive into the story.
The heavy oak door slammed shut. The crystal glasses in the glass front kitchen cabinet rattled against their wooden shelves. A sharp, high-pitched clinking sound, then absolute silence. Clara stood frozen by the kitchen island. She was 32 years old and exactly 7 months pregnant. The physical weight of the third trimester usually made her lower back ache by this time of the afternoon. But right now, she could not feel her back. She could not feel her legs. She could only feel the cold, metallic taste of copper flooding the back of her throat. Her right hand rested on the cool white marble of the countertop. Her left hand hovered over a thick, cream-colored manila folder. Harrison had left it there, her husband of 4 years. The billionaire real estate developer who color-coded his closet and never left a single document out of place. He had left this folder sitting perfectly square in the center of the island, right next to a bowl of green apples. It was not an accident. Harrison did not do accidents. Clara stared at the bold, black letters printed across the top of the first page. Petition for mandatory prenatal paternity establishment. The words did not make sense. They were English, but strung together. They formed a sentence her brain simply refused to process. Paternity, prenatal, mandatory. She picked up the thick stack of paper. The pages felt heavy, too heavy. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon, skipping over the whereas and hereby clauses until they locked onto her own name, Clara Evelyn Vance, and below it, the name of her husband, Harrison James Vance, and then the demand, a formal legal request for a non-invasive blood test to establish the biological father of the unborn child currently resting against her ribs. I am looking at a mistake. This is for someone else. This cannot be my life. She dropped the paper. It landed on the marble with a soft, dismissive slap. A sharp kick just below her ribs made her gasp. The baby was awake. The sudden spike of adrenaline in Clara's bloodstream had woken her daughter. Clara pressed a trembling hand to the side of her swollen stomach. "It is a mistake," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "Just a mix-up from the legal department." She reached into her maternity jeans pocket and pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She opened her contacts. She tapped Harrison's name. His contact photo filled the screen, a candid shot of him smiling at a charity gala last winter. He looked so handsome, so safe. She locked the screen. The screen went black. She unlocked it again, stared at his face. She locked it. She unlocked it. 3 times. Lock, unlock, lock, unlock, lock. Her thumb shook so violently she dropped the phone. It clattered against the marble counter, right next to the legal folder. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt incredibly thin. The harsh glare of the under-cabinet lighting burned her eyes. The smell of Harrison's expensive vetiver cologne still lingered in the air, mixed with the sharp scent of the lemon cleaner the housekeeper used on the floors. It was a suffocating combination. Footsteps echoed in the grand hallway, slow, measured, heavy. The sound of expensive leather shoes against polished hardwood. Clara turned around. Harrison stood in the arched doorway of the kitchen. He was 39 years old, but he carried himself with the authority of an ancient king. He wore a charcoal gray custom suit, the tie already perfectly loosened at the collar. He did not look angry. He did not look sad. He looked completely, terrifyingly blank. "You found it," Harrison said. His voice was flat, a statement of fact, not a question. Clara opened her mouth, but her throat was completely dry. She swallowed hard, trying to force moisture back into her mouth. "Harrison," she managed to say. Her voice sounded thin and entirely unfamiliar. "What is this? Is this some kind of joke from your legal team? Because it is not funny." Harrison walked into the room. He bypassed Clara entirely. He walked straight to the custom wet bar built into the far wall of the kitchen. He picked up a heavy crystal glass. He reached for the silver ice bucket. The tongs clicked against the ice. 1 cube, 2 cubes. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. "It is not a joke, Clara," he said, keeping his back to her. He picked up a bottle of aged scotch. The amber liquid splashed over the ice. "The clinic has an opening tomorrow morning at 9. My driver will take us." Clara took a step forward. The room tilted slightly. She grabbed the edge of the kitchen island to steady herself. "The clinic," she repeated. "For a paternity test. Harrison, look at me." He turned around. He took a slow sip of his drink. The ice clinked against the glass. He finally looked at her. But he did not look at her face. He looked directly at her stomach. His eyes were completely dead. "Yes, a paternity test," he said smoothly, "because I am not going to sign my name to a birth certificate or a trust fund until I know exactly what I am paying for." The words hit her like a physical blow, a hard, closed fist right to the center of her chest. "What you are paying for," Clara gasped. The shock was beginning to crack, making way for the first, agonizing sharp spikes of raw pain. "This is your daughter." This is our baby. We tried for 2 years. We went through 3 rounds of fertility treatments. You held my hand while they gave me the injections. People change. Clara, Harrison interrupted. His tone was conversational. He could have been discussing the weather. Situations change. And unfortunately, my security team brought some things to my attention. Clara stared at him, the man she loved, the man who had kissed her forehead this very morning before leaving for the office. He felt like a complete stranger wearing her husband's face. Your security team, she asked, her voice trembling. Harrison, what are you talking about? He sighed, a heavy, burdened sigh, as if she were a difficult employee wasting his valuable time. He walked slowly toward the island. He set his glass down next to the manila folder. He leaned forward, resting both hands on the marble, trapping her in his space. The smell of vetiver and scotch was overpowering. Don't do this, Clara, he said softly. Don't play the victim. It is insulting to my intelligence. I know about the hotel. Clara blinked. Her mind raced, violently spinning through her memories. The hotel. What hotel? The Grand View, Harrison said. He reached out and tapped a manicured finger against the manila folder. 3 months ago, you told me you were having dinner with your old architecture firm. A little reunion. But my security team pulled the valet logs. Your car was parked at the Grandview Hotel for 4 hours, and so was Marcus Thorne's car. Marcus, her former boss, a man happily married for 20 years who had been mentoring Clara through her transition out of the corporate world. The absurdity of the accusation was so massive, it briefly paralyzed her. Marcus, Clara's voice cracked. Harrison, we had dinner at the steakhouse next to the Grandview. The valet stands are shared. The restaurant validates the hotel parking. I brought you home a slice of cheesecake from that dinner. You ate it in bed. Harrison S. expression did not change. Not a single muscle twitched. A very convenient cover story, he said quietly. But it doesn't matter. The truth is, Clara, I have been watching you for months. I have investigators following you. I know about the deleted text messages. I know about the cash withdrawals. I know everything. The ringing in Clara's ears grew louder, a high-pitched whine that threatened to block out his voice. Investigators following her for months, while they were picking out cribs, while they were painting the nursery soft yellow, while he was kissing her stomach at night and talking to the baby. He had men in dark cars following her, watching her buy groceries, watching her go to prenatal yoga. You are out of your mind, Clara whispered. Tears finally broke free, hot and stinging against her cold cheeks. You are having some kind of paranoid breakdown. I have never, not for one single second, been unfaithful to you. Then the test will prove it. Harrison countered smoothly. He picked up his scotch. He took another sip. If you have nothing to hide, you will sign the consent form on page 4. We will go to the clinic tomorrow. They draw a little bit of your blood. They draw a little bit of mine. We have the results in less than a week. He stepped back, creating distance between them. The coldness radiating from him was absolute. But let me be perfectly clear. Harrison continued, his voice dropping an octave. If you refuse to sign that paper, Clara, if you try to delay, if you call a lawyer and try to make this difficult, I will freeze every joint account we have. I will cancel your credit cards by midnight. I will lock you out of this house. And I will destroy your reputation so thoroughly that your own mother won't speak to you. The threat hung in the air, heavy, toxic. Clara looked into his eyes. She searched frantically for the man she married. She looked for a flicker of doubt, a sign of anger, even a trace of sorrow. There was nothing, just a vast, empty void. You want to ruin me, she realized, speaking the thought aloud over a shared parking lot. I want to protect my assets. Harrison corrected her smoothly. Sign the paper. Clara, I will see you at dinner. He turned his back on her. He walked out of the kitchen, taking his glass of scotch with him. His footsteps echoed down the grand hallway, growing fainter and fainter until the heavy door of his home office clicked shut. Silence descended on the kitchen again. Clara stood alone. The baby kicked violently against her ribs again, a sharp rolling movement that made Clara double over. She could not breathe. The oxygen in the room was completely gone. She stumbled away from the kitchen island. She did not know where she was going. Her body moved on pure instinct. She needed a small space. She needed walls that were close together. She practically crawled down the short hallway to the guest bathroom. She pushed the door open. She stumbled inside and slammed the door shut behind her. She reached up with trembling hands and flipped the lock. The metallic click was the loudest sound in the world. Clara sank to the floor. Her knees hit the expensive imported tile. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her back pressed hard against the cool wood of the door. She pulled her knees up as far as her pregnant belly would allow. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly back and forth. The bathroom was entirely dark. She had not turned on the light. The only illumination came from a sliver of gray daylight creeping through the frosted window above the bathtub. She reached up and grabbed a washcloth from the stack on the vanity shelf. She turned on the cold water tap just enough to wet the cloth. She pressed the freezing cotton against the back of her neck. Breathe, just breathe. In, out. The air was ragged in her throat. She sounded like a wounded animal. Her mind spun in vicious, chaotic circles. How long had he been thinking this? How many times had he smiled at her across the dinner table while picturing her with another man? How many times had he touched her belly, feeling his child kick, while secretly planning to serve her with legal papers? It was a betrayal so profound, so absolute, that her brain could not map the edges of it. She pressed her hands hard against her stomach. The baby was restless, agitated by her mother's racing heart. I'm sorry, Clara whispered into the dark room. I'm so sorry. Baby, it's okay. Mama is here. She closed her eyes. The image of the manila folder burned against the inside of her eyelids. Petition for mandatory prenatal paternity establishment. Harrison had investigators following her. He had monitored her parking. He had accused her of the ultimate betrayal, without a single shred of actual proof. and he had done it with the cold, calculated efficiency of a corporate merger. He didn't scream. He didn't break things. He just calmly dismantled her entire reality over a glass of scotch. Clara lowered the washcloth. The freezing water dripped down her spine, making her shiver. She stared into the dark corner of the bathroom. The initial, blinding shock was beginning to recede, and in its place, something else was slowly trying to take root. A deep, agonizing ache. The terrifying realization that the life she had built over the last 4 years was nothing but a fragile illusion. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The air finally filled the bottom of her lungs. I am not crazy. I know exactly where I was that night. I know who I am. She spoke the words out loud, breaking the silence of the dark room. I am not crazy. She repeated it, a lifeline thrown into the dark, a single anchor in a world that had just been completely turned upside down. She would take the test. She had to, because without it, she would be destitute by tomorrow morning. She would give him his blood. She would let him see the results. But as Clara sat on the cold bathroom tile, feeling her daughter move inside her, one thing became absolutely clear. The test would prove Harrison was the father, but the marriage was already dead. A low, heavy rumble of thunder shook the frosted window panes. A jagged flash of lightning illuminated the dark bathroom for a fraction of a second. The sudden burst of white light made Clara flinch. The storm had finally broken. She pressed her palms flat against the cold floor tiles and slowly pushed herself up. Her knees popped loudly in the quiet room. The thick, elastic waistband of her maternity jeans dug sharply into her swollen stomach. She winced. The baby shifted again, a heavy, rolling pressure against her bladder. Clara unlocked the bathroom door. The metallic click echoed in the hallway. She stepped out. The house was dead quiet. The only sound was the soft, persistent hum of the massive double-door refrigerator in the kitchen. She walked back to the kitchen island. The manila folder was still there. Her phone was still lying exactly where she had dropped it. She reached out to grab the phone. Her hand stopped an inch from the screen. I know about the deleted text messages. Harrison S. voice echoed in her head, cold, flat, absolute. A new wave of panic washed over her. A cold sweat broke out across the back of her neck. How could he know about deleted messages? Unless he had installed spyware. Unless he had cloned her phone. Every text to her mother. Every Google search about baby names. Every private complaint to her best friend about her swollen ankles. He had been reading all of it. He had been inside her pocket, watching her every move. For months. The device on the marble counter suddenly looked like a venomous snake. Clara did not touch it. She left her phone sitting on the island. She walked quickly to the mudroom by the back door. She pulled on her yellow raincoat. The rubbery material squeaked as she pushed her arms through the sleeves. She grabbed her car keys from the silver bowl by the door. She grabbed a spare $50 bill she kept hidden in the lining of her winter coat. She opened the heavy back door. The wind howled. Sheets of freezing rain blew onto the porch. Clara stepped out into the storm. The cold rain hit her face like tiny needles. She practically ran to her car, parked in the driveway. She climbed into the driver's seat. She slammed the door shut. The heavy thud cut off the sound of the storm, leaving only the violent drumming of rain against the metal roof. She started the engine. The heater blasted cold air against her wet face. She gripped the steering wheel tightly. She threw the car into reverse and backed out of the driveway. She drove exactly 2 miles down the road to a generic 24-hour drugstore. The fluorescent lights inside the store buzzed loudly. The smell of cheap laundry detergent and wet cardboard hung in the stale air. Her wet sneakers squeaked against the linoleum floor. Clara walked straight to the electronics aisle. She grabbed a cheap, prepaid cell phone in a plastic blister pack. She grabbed a $20 minute card. She walked to the register. She handed the $50 bill to the bored teenager behind the counter. She did not speak. She took her change and walked back out into the rain. She sat in the drugstore parking lot for 15 minutes, fighting with the plastic packaging. Her fingernails tore. A tiny drop of blood welled up on her thumb. She sucked on the cut, tasting salt and copper, and finally ripped the package open. She activated the phone. The screen glowed a harsh, cheap blue. She dialed a number from memory. She held the plastic phone to her ear. It rang twice. Hello, Brooke's voice. Warm, familiar, slightly annoyed by an unknown number. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Brooke, it is me. It is Clara. Clara, why are you calling from this number? You sound terrible. Are you crying? Listen to me, Clara said. Her voice was shaking, but she forced the words out. I am at the drugstore on 5th Street. I am using a burner phone. Please do not text my regular phone. Please do not call it. Harrison is tracking it. A long silence filled the car. The rain pounded relentlessly against the windshield. When Brooke spoke again, all the warmth was gone. Her voice was razor sharp. What did he do? Are you safe? Do I need to call the police? I am safe, Clara said quickly. Physically, I am safe. But Brooke, he handed me legal papers. He is demanding a prenatal paternity test. He is what? Brooke practically screamed into the phone. He says he has investigators following me. He accused me of sleeping with Marcus Thorne. He threatened to freeze all our accounts and lock me out of the house if I don't sign the consent form tomorrow morning. That absolute sociopath. Brooke hissed. The venom in her voice was immediate. She did not ask if it was true. She did not doubt Clara for a single second. I am coming to get you right now. No, Clara said. Do not come here. I need to go back to the house. If he realizes I left without my phone, he will know I figured out he is tracking me. I cannot give him a reason to freeze the accounts tonight. I need to be strategic. Clara, you cannot stay in that house with him. I have to. Clara insisted. She wiped a mixture of rain and tears from her cheek. I need you to come to the house in exactly 1 hour. Pretend you just dropped by to bring me some decaf coffee. Act completely normal. I am going to punch him in his perfectly chiseled jaw. Brooke threatened. Please, Brooke, just do this for me. I need someone in the room with me. I feel like I am losing my mind. You are not losing your mind. Honey, you are married to a monster. I will be there in 50 minutes. Clara hung up. The screen went black. She rested her forehead against the cold steering wheel. The smell of wet wool from her raincoat filled the small cabin. She drove back to the house in silence. The massive iron gates swung open as her car approached. The house loomed at the end of the driveway like a dark fortress. Only the lights in Harrison S. home office on the second floor were turned on. Clara parked the car. She left the burner phone hidden deep inside the glove compartment. She walked back into the house through the mudroom. She took off her wet raincoat and hung it on a brass hook. She walked back into the kitchen. Her phone was still sitting on the marble island. She picked it up. She swiped the screen. No new messages. She carried it with her into the living room. She sat down on the large, velvet sofa. The room was dark, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning from the storm outside. She waited. 45 minutes later, the doorbell rang. A sharp, piercing chime. Clara stood up. Her back ached violently. She walked to the front foyer and opened the heavy oak door. Brooke stood on the porch, holding a brown paper bag from a local bakery. She wore an oversized sweater and dark jeans. Her dark hair was dripping wet from the rain. Brooke stepped inside. She dropped the bakery bag onto the console table. She wrapped her arms around Clara in a tight, fierce hug. The smell of rain and damp cotton enveloped Clara. He is upstairs. Clara whispered into Brooke's shoulder. Brooke pulled back. Her eyes were blazing with protective fury. Show me the papers. Clara led her into the kitchen. She picked up the manila folder from the island and handed it to Brooke. Brooke leaned against the counter. She read the first page. She flipped to the second page. Her jaw tightened with every sentence she read. This is insane, Brooke whispered fiercely. Clara, this is textbook paranoia. Marcus Thorne. You haven't seen Marcus outside of a crowded restaurant in a year. He said his security team pulled valet logs from the Grandview Hotel, Clara explained. Her voice was hollow. He said my car was there for 4 hours, and Marcus's car was there too. Brooke looked up from the papers. She stared at Clara in disbelief. Clara, the Grandview shares a parking structure with the steakhouse where they held the firm's reunion dinner. Everyone parked there. He took a basic logistical fact and twisted it into a conspiracy. I know, Clara said. I told him that. He didn't care. He said he knows about my deleted texts. He said he knows about my cash withdrawals. Brooke slammed the folder down on the marble counter. The slap echoed loudly. Of course you withdraw cash, Brooke whispered angrily. You pay the landscapers in cash every 2 weeks because he refuses to set up a direct deposit for them. And you delete texts because your storage is always full of baby ultrasound pictures. He is taking normal, everyday things and building a criminal case against you. He looked at me with completely dead eyes. Brooke, he told me if I didn't sign this, he would destroy my reputation. He would make sure my own mother wouldn't speak to me. Brooke grabbed Clara's hands. She squeezed them tightly. Her skin was warm. Listen to me, Brooke said firmly. He is gaslighting you. He is trying to make you doubt your own reality so you will submit to his control. This is what narcissists do when they feel threatened. They invent a crime, pin it on you, and play the victim. Clara closed her eyes. The words washed over her. They felt incredibly validating, but they did not erase the terror pooling in her stomach. But why now? Clara asked, her voice trembling. Why do this right before the baby is born? We were happy. I thought we were happy. Brooke shook her head slowly. I don't know. Honey, but you need to call Thomas Reed. He handled my cousin S divorce. He is a shark. And you need to sign this consent form tomorrow. Clara opened her eyes. You think I should take the test? Absolutely, Brooke said. Her voice was steady and resolute. You take the test. You give him the blood. You let the clinic print the paper that proves you are completely innocent. You take away his only weapon. And then what? Clara asked. And then, Brooke said, her eyes narrowing, you pack your bags and you leave. A long silence stretched between them. The refrigerator hummed. The rain beat against the window. Leave. The word felt impossible. Where would she go? How would she raise a child without his money? The fear of the unknown threatened to choke her. But then she remembered the look in Harrison's eyes, the absolute lack of empathy, the terrifying calculation. He did not see her as his pregnant wife. He saw her as an asset to be managed, a liability to be neutralized. Clara took a deep breath. The panic in her chest began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I am not crazy. I know what I saw. I know exactly where I was that night. She looked down at the manila folder. The bold black letters no longer looked like a threat. They looked like a confession of his cruelty. Okay, Clara said simply. Her voice was surprisingly steady. She picked up a black ink pen sitting in a silver cup next to the phone. She flipped to the fourth page of the legal document. She pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed smoothly. Clara Evelyn Vance. She signed her name on the dotted line. She did not hesitate. She did not tremble. I will take his test, Clara said. She put the pen down. She looked at her best friend. The tears were completely gone. But the minute those results come back, he is going to wish he never asked for them. The leather seat of the luxury SUV was cold. Clara stared out the tinted window as the city streets blurred past. The rain from last night had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and gray under the morning sun. Harrison sat right next to her. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his expensive wool suit. He was reading a quarterly earnings report on his tablet. He looked completely relaxed. He did not look like a man who had just accused his pregnant wife of an affair. He looked like a man commuting to the office. The SUV slowed to a halt in front of a towering glass building in the medical district. The driver opened the door. Harrison stepped out first. He turned and offered Clara his hand. He smiled. A perfect, warm, devastatingly handsome smile. He placed his hand gently on the small of her back to guide her toward the revolving doors, to the driver, to the pedestrians on the sidewalk. He was the picture of a devoted, protective husband. Clara felt completely sick. His touch burned through her maternity blouse. She remembered a time when that exact touch made her feel safe. 3 years ago, walking through a crowded art gallery in Paris. He had placed his hand on the small of her back, leaned down, and whispered that she was the most beautiful woman in the room. She had believed him. She had abandoned her career in architecture because he promised to build a world just for her. Now every memory felt like a lie. The good times were completely tainted. He had not built a world for her. He had built a beautiful, velvet-lined cage. Smile, Clara. Harrison murmured under his breath as they walked into the lobby. His lips barely moved. The receptionist is looking at us. Clara forced the corners of her mouth upward. It felt like her face might crack. The private clinic occupied the entire 50th floor. It did not look like a hospital. It looked like a luxury spa. The air smelled of eucalyptus and faint lavender. Soft, instrumental music played from hidden speakers. A nurse in pristine white scrubs greeted them immediately. Mr. and Mrs. Vance, Dr. Sterling is ready for you in Suite A. They walked down a quiet, carpeted hallway. The heavy wooden door of the examination room clicked shut behind them. The room was filled with state-of-the-art medical equipment. A large ultrasound monitor hung on the wall. A leather examination chair sat in the center of the room. The sharp, sterile smell of rubbing alcohol cut through the lavender scent from the hallway. Dr. Sterling walked in. He was a tall man with silver hair and a warm, grandfatherly demeanor. "Good morning," Dr. Sterling said cheerfully. He shook Harrison's hand. He offered Clara a gentle smile. "I understand we are doing a non-invasive prenatal paternity test today, and we will do a quick ultrasound just to check on our little passenger." "Yes," Harrison said smoothly. He took Clara's hand and squeezed it. The pressure was warningly tight. Just a formality for the family trust. "My mother insisted on having all the paperwork in order before the birth." He lied with absolute ease. He did not blink. He did not hesitate. Clara sat on the edge of the examination chair. She felt entirely invisible. She was just a vessel, a piece of property being audited for authenticity. "All right, Clara," Dr. Sterling said. "We will start with the blood draw. Just a quick pinch." The nurse tied a rubber tourniquet around Clara S. arm. The rubber snapped against her skin. The nurse wiped a cotton ball soaked in alcohol over the crook of her elbow. The needle pierced her skin. A sharp, tiny sting. Clara watched the dark red blood flow into the plastic vial. It was her blood, her life force, being drained away to satisfy a madman's paranoia. Next, the nurse took a swab from the inside of Harrison's cheek. He did not flinch. He handed the plastic tube back to the nurse with a polite nod. "Excellent," Dr. Sterling said. "Now, let us take a look at the baby. Lean back." Clara. Clara lay back on the leather chair. She lifted her shirt. The doctor squirted a generous amount of clear gel onto her stomach. The gel was freezing cold. Clara shivered. The doctor pressed the plastic transducer against her skin. He moved it in slow, circular motions. The large monitor on the wall flickered to life. Grainy black and white shapes appeared. And then a sound filled the room. Swoosh, swoosh. Swoosh, swoosh, the rapid, rhythmic beating of her daughter's heart. It was loud. It was strong. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. Tears immediately pricked Clara's eyes. She could not stop them. The sharp contrast between the miracle of her baby and the toxic, clinical coldness of this room was too much to bear. Harrison stepped closer to the monitor. He crossed his arms over his chest. He stared at the screen, analyzing the black and white image with the same intensity he used to review architectural blueprints. Just then, Harrison S.'s cell phone vibrated loudly in his breast pocket. He pulled it out. He frowned at the screen. "Excuse me," Harrison said to the doctor. "This is my London office. It is a critical acquisition. I have to take this in the hall." "Of course," Dr. Sterling said, without looking away from the monitor. Harrison walked out of the room. The heavy door clicked shut. The room was suddenly peaceful. Just the swoosh of the baby's heartbeat. The doctor pressed a button on the machine, freezing the image. He wiped the cold gel off Clara S.'s stomach with a soft paper towel. "Everything looks absolutely perfect." "Clara," Dr. Sterling said warmly. "She is growing right on schedule." "Thank you," Dr. Clara whispered. She sat up and pulled her shirt down. The doctor walked over to the stainless steel counter to label the blood vials. He picked up a pen. "We will send these out to the lab immediately," Dr. Sterling said in a casual, conversational tone. "The standard paternity results take about 3 days, but we should have the results of the extended genetic panel by next Tuesday." Clara froze. Her hand stopped midway to her purse. "I am sorry," Clara said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Did you say an extended genetic panel?" Dr. Sterling turned around. He looked slightly confused. "Yes. Mr. Vance requested a comprehensive genetic trace alongside the paternity test. Did he not mention it?" Clara felt the blood drain entirely from her face. The room seemed to tilt. "No," she managed to say. "He did not." "What exactly is a comprehensive genetic trace?" The doctor put down his pen. He adopted a serious, medical tone. "It is a highly specialized test. Clara, usually, we only run it if there is a known history of severe, hereditary diseases in the family. It screens the baby's DNA against a massive national registry. It looks for genetic markers for over 400 rare conditions. Everything from cystic fibrosis to extremely rare neurological disorders." The ringing in Clara's ears started again. "Why would he request that?" Clara asked. "We already did the standard chromosomal screening at 12 weeks. The baby is perfectly healthy." Dr. Sterling sighed softly. "Sometimes parents just want absolute certainty, especially in families with significant wealth. They want to know every possible medical scenario. It is unusual to do it without the mother's explicit knowledge, but legally, as the father on record, he can request it." Clara could not breathe. The pieces began to fall into place. A terrifying, jagged puzzle coming together in her mind. Harrison did not think she was cheating. Harrison did not care about Marcus Thorne or a shared parking lot at a hotel. The entire accusation, the private investigators, the threats to freeze her bank accounts. It was all a distraction, a massive, theatrical smokescreen. He needed her blood. He needed the baby's DNA. And he needed a legally binding reason to demand it. He wasn't looking for another man's DNA. He was looking for his own. He was terrified that this baby might inherit something. Something he already knew existed. The heavy examination door opened. Harrison walked back in. He slipped his phone into his pocket. Everything finished? He asked smoothly. Clara stared at him. She looked at his perfectly tailored suit, his expensive shoes, his handsome, entirely unreadable face. He was a monster, and he was using their unborn child as a pawn in a game she did not even know she was playing. Yes, Clara said. Her voice was completely dead. We are finished. 10 minutes later, Clara walked out of the glass building alone. Harrison had a breakfast meeting. His driver had taken him downtown. Clara had insisted on walking to the private parking garage 2 blocks away where she had parked her own SUV earlier that morning. The city noise rushed around her. Honking cars, sirens in the distance, people rushing with coffee cups. But Clara felt like she was walking underwater. She reached the concrete parking structure. She found her white SUV on the third floor. She unlocked the doors. She climbed into the driver's seat. She shut the door, cutting off the noise of the garage. She did not put the key in the ignition. She sat in the heavy silence. Her hands gripped the leather steering wheel. She squeezed the wheel so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Her short fingernails dug into the leather. She stared straight ahead at the concrete wall. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes passed. She did not cry. The shock was too deep for tears. It bypassed sadness and settled into a cold, dark pit in the very center of her stomach. 3 times. Lock, unlock, lock, unlock, lock. The memory of checking her phone yesterday flashed through her mind. She had been so afraid of him then, so terrified of losing his love. Now, sitting in the parked car, the fear evaporated. I am not crazy, Clara whispered to the empty car. I know what I saw. I know what he is doing. She closed her eyes. She took a slow, deep breath. The smell of the leather interior grounded her. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He thought he could manipulate her, frighten her, and use their child to protect whatever dark secret he was hiding. Clara finally reached forward and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. She wasn't going to wait for him to destroy her. She was going to find out exactly what Harrison Vance was hiding in his DNA. And then she was going to burn his velvet cage to the ground. The cheap metal key scraped harshly against the deadbolt. The door hinges whined a high, sharp complaint as Clara pushed her way inside. She dropped her heavy leather tote bag onto the scuffed hardwood floor. The heavy thud echoed off the bare, off-white walls. She was standing in a 2-bedroom, short-term rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. It smelled faintly of bleach and old dust. It was completely empty, save for a rented sofa, a small dining table, and a mattress on the floor in the bedroom. It was not a billionaire-esque mansion. It did not have a marble kitchen island or a custom wet bar, but it had one crucial, priceless feature. Harrison did not have a key. That morning, Clara had met with Thomas Reed. He was a 55-year-old divorce attorney with silver hair, a quiet voice, and the methodical patience of a chess grandmaster. Thomas did not express outrage when Clara told him about the paternity test. He simply opened a fresh legal pad and told her exactly what to do. Move out today, Thomas had said, his pen scratching across the paper. Transfer exactly half of the liquid cash from the joint checking account into a new bank, not a penny more, and download every single financial statement from the last 4 years before he changes the passwords. Now, it was midnight. Clara sat at the small wobbly dining table. The harsh blue light of the laptop screen illuminated the dark room. The steady click, click, click of the computer mouse sounded like a metronome in the dead silence. She reached blindly for her mug. She took a sip. The day-old coffee was freezing cold. It tasted bitter, stale, like ash in her mouth. She swallowed it anyway and kept scrolling. Line after line of expenses, private jets, charity dinners, custom suits, thousands of dollars moving seamlessly through the digital world. Clara S. eyes burned. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, heavy ache. The baby was pressing uncomfortably against her spine. Come on, Clara whispered to the glowing screen. You are too controlling to leave things to chance. Where are you hiding it? She opened the statements from 2 years ago, the year Harrison S. business trips to the London office had suddenly doubled. She scrolled down to the third page of December. Her eyes caught on a line item, a wire transfer, $15,000, sent to an entity listed as Apex Logistics. Clara frowned. Harrison S. Real Estate Company used massive, corporate shipping firms. Apex Logistics sounded small, generic, invisible. She clicked the search function on the banking portal. She typed in the word Apex. The screen loaded for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the results flooded the screen. January, $15,000 to Apex Logistics. February, $15,000. March, $15,000. Every single month. On the 15th day, $15,000 vanished from their primary joint account into the black hole of Apex Logistics. Over 3 years, it added up to more than $500,000. Clara grabbed her burner phone. She did not care that it was 12:30 in the morning. She dialed Brooke S. number. Brooke answered on the second ring. Her voice was thick with sleep. Clara, is everything okay? I need your cousin, Clara said rapidly. The one who works as a forensic accountant. I need a favor right now. Brooke cleared her throat, suddenly awake. What did you find? A company called Apex Logistics, Clara said. The adrenaline was pushing the exhaustion completely out of her body. Harrison has been wiring them $15,000 every month for 3 years. I need to know who owns that company. Give me 5 minutes, Brooks said. The line went dead. Clara stood up. She paced the length of the small living room. Her bare feet slapped against the cold hardwood floor. The fear that had paralyzed her in the mansion was completely gone. The sadness of losing her husband had evaporated. In its place, a new powerful emotion was rising, a slow boiling fury. He had looked her in the eye and accused her of stealing time at a hotel. Meanwhile, He was bleeding their accounts dry. The burner phone buzzed violently in her hand. Clara answered it before the first ring finished. "Tell me," Clara demanded. "It is a shell company," Brooke said. Her voice was completely flat. "Registered in Delaware. It does not sell logistics. It does not sell anything." "Who is the registered agent?" Clara asked. Her grip on the plastic phone tightened. Brooke took a sharp breath. "Clara, the primary officer listed on the incorporation documents is Jillian Hayes." The name hung in the air. Jillian Hayes. Harrison S., 28-year-old executive assistant. The young woman who always bought Clara S. birthday presents on Harrison S. behalf. The woman who smiled brightly and offered Clara sparkling water whenever she visited the corporate office. Clara closed her eyes. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together. The cheating accusation, the private investigators, the sudden, terrifying threat to freeze all her money. It was pure projection. Harrison was terrified she would find out about his affair with his assistant. He had manufactured a crisis. He had put Clara entirely on the defensive, forcing her to scramble to prove her own innocence. So she would be too distracted to notice he was funneling $500,000 to his mistress, Clara. Brooke asked gently through the phone, "Are you still there?" "I am here," Clara said. Her voice did not shake. It was cold, hard, like tempered glass. "What do you want me to do?" Brooke asked. "Nothing," Clara replied. "We do not say a word. We let him think his little distraction worked. Good night." "Brooke." Clara hung up the phone. She set it gently on the table, next to the laptop. The tears did not come. She was done crying. She felt an overwhelming, righteous anger building in her chest, a fierce, protective heat that radiated straight down to the baby in her womb. He thought she was weak. He thought she was just a pregnant housewife who would panic and beg for his forgiveness. He had no idea who he was dealing with. She looked at the digital clock on the laptop screen. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. Clara walked away from the table. She walked into the tiny, narrow kitchen of the rental apartment. She turned on the overhead fluorescent light. It buzzed loudly. She opened the small pantry closet. Inside, there were 3 plastic grocery bags she had quickly bought that afternoon. She reached into the bags. She pulled out a can of chicken soup. She placed it on the bare laminate shelf. She pulled out a second can. She placed it exactly 2 inches away from the first. Face forward, she pulled out a box of pasta. She aligned the edge of the cardboard perfectly with the edge of the shelf. For the next 20 minutes, Clara did not think about billionaires, or shell companies, or divorce attorneys. She just focused on the smooth metal of the cans, the sharp corners of the boxes, the smell of the cheap laminate wood. She moved slowly, methodically, deliberately. She lined up every single item. She turned all the labels to face the front. She created perfect, unbroken rows of order. When she was finished, she stepped back. She stared at the perfectly organized pantry. It was a tiny, insignificant space, but it was hers. She controlled it. She brought order to it. Clara closed the pantry door. The soft click echoed in the quiet kitchen. She turned off the buzzing light. She walked to the mattress on the floor. She lay down in the dark. She placed one hand over her swollen stomach. Harrison Vance had started a war to hide his secrets, but Clara was going to finish it to protect her child. The rattling window air conditioning unit sputtered, coughed, and died. The silence that followed was heavy. Within 10 minutes, the suffocating summer heat pressed into the small rental apartment. The air grew thick and stagnant. Clara lay on the bare mattress on the bedroom floor, her silk blouse stuck to her back, entirely ruined by sweat. Her cheek rested against a damp pillowcase. She could smell the faint, sour scent of her own exhaustion mixed with the dusty floorboards. She reached for her regular phone, the one she had to keep turned on for the lawyers. The screen was flooded, dozens of notifications, missed calls from numbers she did not recognize, text messages from acquaintances she hadn't spoken to in years. She tapped a news alert, a prominent gossip website. Billionaire Harrison Vance separates from pregnant wife. Insider claims infidelity discovered. Harrison had leaked it. He was spinning the narrative before the divorce papers were even filed. He was playing the tragic. Betrayed husband on a public stage. Clara dropped the phone onto the floor. The screen cracked slightly against the wood. She pulled her knees up, curling her body around her swollen stomach. The sheer gravity of her situation finally crushed the last of her adrenaline. She was completely alone. She was fighting a billionaire with infinite resources. She was carrying a child who would be born into the middle of a brutal, public war zone. A sob tore through her throat. It was an ugly, guttural sound. The tears came violently. They burned her eyes and choked her breathing. The walls of the tiny bedroom felt like they were shrinking, closing in on her. She buried her face in the damp pillow, muffling the sound of her own breakdown. God, I was so stupid. The thought was loud and absolute in her mind. The signs were all there. The late nights, the sudden changes in passwords, the way he looked at me like an employee who was underperforming. I let him make me small. I traded my voice for a quiet life. A sudden sharp kick against her ribs made her gasp. The baby, strong and restless, a physical reminder inside her own body. Clara placed her hand over the spot. The baby kicked again, harder this time. It felt like a tiny, urgent demand to wake up. Clara wiped her face with the back of her trembling hand. She forced herself to sit up on the mattress. The room spun, just slightly, but enough to make her grab the wall for balance. She took a deep, ragged breath. The air was hot, but she pulled it all the way into her lungs. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. 3 sharp, authoritative raps. Clara froze. Her heart hammered against her chest. Harrison, he had found her. He had tracked the rental agreement. She slowly stood up. Her back throbbed. She walked quietly into the small living room. She did not turn on the lights. She crept to the front door and pressed her eye against the small brass peephole. It was not Harrison. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was a woman in a pale gray Chanel suit. Her silver hair was styled into an immaculate bob. She held a black crocodile leather handbag. Evelyn Vance, Harrison S. mother. Clara unlocked the deadbolt. The door swung open immediately. The scent of expensive lavender and powder cut through the stale air of the apartment. Evelyn always wore lavender. Even now, standing in a cheap rental hallway, she smelled like an exclusive country club. Evelyn did not wait for an invitation. She stepped past Clara into the apartment. She looked around the empty living room. Her eyes dragged over the scuffed floors, the rented sofa, and the broken air conditioning unit in the window. Her upper lip curled in profound distaste. Close the door. Clara, Evelyn commanded. Her voice was sharp, cultured, entirely devoid of warmth. Clara shut the door. She crossed her arms defensively over her chest. How did you find me? Evelyn, my son has a security team, Evelyn said dismissively. She did not sit down. The sofa was clearly beneath her. They know everything. They knew you were here before you even unpacked your single suitcase. Clara stood her ground. What do you want? Evelyn unclasped her crocodile handbag. The golden hardware clicked loudly. She reached inside and pulled out a crisp, cream-colored envelope. She walked over to the small dining table. She placed the envelope down and slid it across the laminate wood toward Clara. There is a cashier's check in that envelope, Evelyn said smoothly, for $2 million. It is completely untraceable. It is yours to keep, tax-free. Clara stared at the envelope. She did not touch it. And what does the $2 million buy? Evelyn, peace. The older woman replied instantly. It buys peace. Along with the check, there is a non-disclosure agreement and a custody waiver. You sign them both. You drop your lawyer. You move to another state. You have the baby quietly, and you never speak to the press or my son ever again. Clara felt a cold chill run down her spine, completely cutting through the heavy summer heat of the room. A custody waiver. You want me to give up my child, Clara whispered. The horror in her voice was absolute. I want you to be realistic, Evelyn corrected her sharply. Harrison is a Vance. This child is a Vance. We do not allow our bloodline to be raised in poverty. And we certainly do not allow our family name to be dragged through a messy, public divorce. Clara looked at her mother-in-law. For 4 years, Evelyn had treated Clara with polite, icy tolerance. But right now, Evelyn looked genuinely desperate. Beneath the aristocratic posture, her eyes were frantic. And then, Clara realized something crucial. He told you, Clara said softly. Evelyn's jaw tightened. I have no idea what you are talking about. He told you about his accusation. Clara continued, stepping closer to the table. He told you I was cheating, but you are here offering me $2 million to walk away quietly. Clara paused. She let the silence stretch. If I was actually carrying another man's child, Evelyn, you would not offer me a dime. You would let the DNA test prove it, and you would throw me to the wolves. You wouldn't care about the press. You would use it to ruin me. Evelyn did not blink. She stood perfectly still. But you are here, Clara said, her voice growing stronger, louder, offering me millions to drop the lawyers. You are trying to stop the legal discovery process. Clara looked down at the envelope. You know he is not protecting himself from me. You know what he is hiding. Take the money. Clara, Evelyn snapped. The cultured mask finally slipped, revealing a terrified, vicious old woman. You have no idea what you are dealing with. Harrison will destroy you. He will bury you under years of litigation until you have nothing left. Take the check before he changes his mind. Clara looked at the $2 million sitting on the cheap dining table, an escape hatch, a fortune that could guarantee her safety. She reached out. She did not take the envelope. Instead, Clara picked up her regular phone with the cracked screen. She opened the camera application. She snapped a clear, bright picture of the cashier's check and the legal documents. The artificial shutter click sounded like a gunshot in the small room. "What are you doing?" Evelyn demanded, stepping forward. Clara put her phone inside her pocket. She looked Evelyn dead in the eye. The vulnerability that had crushed her 30 minutes ago was completely burned away. "I am gathering evidence," Clara said. "You can take your check. Evelyn, you can take your non-disclosure agreement, and you can get out of my home." Evelyn stared at her in shock. "You are making a terrible mistake." "The only mistake I made was thinking I was part of your family," Clara said. She walked to the front door and pulled it open. "Tell Harrison the DNA test results come back on Tuesday. I will see him at the clinic. Do not ever come near me again." Evelyn snatched the envelope off the table. She marched to the door, her face pale with fury. She stepped out into the hallway and turned back. "You will lose everything." Evelyn spat. Clara stood in the doorway. She rested one hand gently on her pregnant stomach. "I already did," Clara replied. "And that is exactly why I am not afraid of him anymore." She slammed the door shut. She locked the deadbolt. She listened to the sharp click of Evelyn's expensive heels fading rapidly down the hallway. Clara closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The apartment was still hot. Her clothes were still damp. But as she stood in the quiet room, she felt something entirely new. She felt powerful. The wall clock in the Dr. S. private office ticked, ticked, ticked. It was Tuesday morning. The air conditioning in the clinic was running too high. A sharp, chemical chill seeped right through Clara's beige maternity sweater. She sat on the far edge of a heavy leather sofa. She kept her hands folded tightly over her lap. Harrison sat in the armchair opposite her. He looked immaculate. A navy blue custom suit, a crisp white shirt. He smelled faintly of fresh espresso and expensive vetiver cologne. He was casually scrolling through emails on his phone, completely unbothered. He looked like a man waiting for a delayed flight, not a man waiting to hear the paternity of his child. The heavy oak door swung open. Dr. Sterling walked into the room. He held a thick, sealed manila folder. The harsh crinkle of the paper cut through the tense silence. Dr. Sterling did not smile today. His warm, grandfatherly demeanor was entirely gone. He looked serious, exhausted. He walked behind his large mahogany desk and sat down in his leather chair. He placed the folder exactly in the center of the dark wood. "Good morning," Dr. Sterling said. His voice was quiet, strictly professional. Harrison locked his phone screen. He slipped the device into his breast pocket. He leaned forward and steepled his fingers together. He looked like a chief executive officer ready to review a quarterly earnings report. Let us get straight to it, Dr. Harrison said smoothly. I have a board meeting at 11. Dr. Sterling looked at Harrison for a long moment. Then he looked down at the folder. He opened it. He pulled out the first crisp white page. The paper rustled loudly in the quiet room. The non-invasive prenatal paternity test is conclusive, Dr. Sterling read aloud. He kept his eyes on the paper. Harrison Vance is the biological father. The probability of paternity is 99.9%. A heavy silence fell over the room. Clara did not gasp. She did not cry. She did not feel a sudden rush of vindication. She already knew the truth. She had known the truth since the very first day. Harrison let out a long, heavy sigh. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked deeply, profoundly relieved. His shoulders visibly dropped. Then he turned his head to look at Clara. The smugness returned to his eyes. It was a terrifying, arrogant confidence. The look of a man who thought he had just won a difficult game. Clara, Harrison said softly. His voice dripped with manufactured sympathy. He was putting on a performance. I am so glad. You have to understand. From my position, I had to be absolutely sure. My wealth makes me a target. I had to protect our assets. Clara stared at him. She watched his mouth move. He was actually trying to play the benevolent king. But now, Harrison continued, his voice lowering to a gentle, forgiving tone. We can put this ugly business behind us. I am willing to forgive the deception with the hotel. I am willing to let you come back to the house for the sake of our family. He reached his right hand out across the empty space between them, an offering of peace, a demand for her submission. Clara looked at his open palm. She felt nothing but cold, absolute disgust. She reached into her small leather purse. She pulled out her left hand. It was entirely bare. She reached forward and placed her diamond wedding ring on the edge of Dr. Sterling's mahogany desk. She pulled her hand back. Then she flicked the heavy platinum band with her index finger. The ring slid rapidly across the polished wood. It hit the silver base of the Dr. S pen holder with a sharp, final clink. It spun in a tight circle. Then it fell flat. Harrison's outstretched hand slowly dropped to his side. The smug, forgiving smile vanished entirely from his face. Keep your forgiveness, Clara said. Her voice was steady. It did not shake. It rang clear and hard in the sterile room. I do not want it. I do not want you. You are going to call your lawyers this afternoon, and you are going to give me exactly what I ask for in the divorce settlement. Harrison's jaw tightened. A dark, dangerous shadow crossed his eyes. The mask of the loving husband was completely gone. The monster was looking at her now. He opened his mouth, drawing a breath to unleash a threat. But Dr. Sterling cleared his throat. It was a loud, deliberate, grinding sound. It stopped Harrison completely. Excuse me, Dr. Sterling said. Both of his hands were resting flat on the manila folder. His knuckles were slightly white. We are not finished here. Clara looked at the doctor. The temperature in the room seemed to suddenly drop another 10 degrees. A sudden, sharp chill ran down the back of her neck. Dr. Sterling slowly turned the first piece of paper over. There was a second page beneath it. It was printed with dense paragraphs of medical text and brightly colored charts. As requested by Mr. Vance, the doctor continued, his voice tight with tension. We ran a comprehensive genetic trace. We screened the baby's DNA against the National Registry. Harrison sat back in his armchair. He crossed his arms defensively over his chest. And the baby is fine. The preliminary chromosomal scan was clear. The baby is perfectly healthy. Dr. Sterling confirmed. He looked directly at Harrison. He did not blink. However, the screening process flagged a severe anomaly, not in the fetus, but in the paternal DNA profile. The silence in the room became thick, suffocating. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. Ticked, ticked, ticked. Harrison uncrossed his arms. The confident posture dissolved instantly. What are you talking about? My medical records are flawless. I run marathons. I do not have any genetic anomalies. Dr. Sterling looked down at the paper. He carefully adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses. When the laboratory computer system ran your specific genetic markers, it triggered an automatic, mandatory alert in the National Medical Database. Dr. Sterling explained. He spoke slowly, making sure every single word was heard. Your specific DNA sequence is already registered in the system. Clara leaned forward. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. Why would his DNA be in the database? Clara asked. Her voice was a breathy whisper. Dr. Sterling did not look at Clara. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the billionaire. It is registered, the doctor said, because it is a direct parental match to an existing pediatric patient. A patient who is currently receiving long-term treatment for a rare, hereditary condition. The words hung in the sterile air. Heavy, devastating, radioactive. A direct parental match to an existing pediatric patient. Harrison S. face drained of all color. He looked like the blood had been instantly sucked out of his veins. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, began to visibly shake. Clara stared at the invincible, untouchable man. He was crumbling right before her eyes. He didn't think I was cheating. The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. It took her breath away. He was never afraid of another man. He was terrified his own sins were contagious. He was terrified the deep. Comprehensive genetic test would expose the child he was already hiding. He created a massive, traumatic distraction to hide his own guilt. Dr. Sterling picked up the second piece of paper. He slid it across the mahogany desk. It stopped right next to Clara S.'s discarded wedding ring. Mr. Vance, the doctor said quietly, according to the National Registry, you have a 3-year-old son. Clara looked at the black ink on the white paper. A 3-year-old son. A shell company called Apex Logistics, $15,000 a month. A 28-year-old executive assistant named Jillian Hayes. The puzzle was finally complete. The picture it formed was grotesque. Clara stood up. She picked up her leather purse. She did not look at the paper. She looked down at Harrison. He was staring blindly at the desk, his chest heaving, completely paralyzed by the sudden, violent destruction of his secret life. "I will see you in court." "Harrison," Clara said softly. She turned around. She opened the heavy oak door, and she walked out of the room without looking back. The heavy glass doors of the medical building slid shut behind her. The sudden rush of city noise hit Clara instantly. A delivery truck rattled over a metal grate in the street. A police siren wailed 3 blocks away. The warm, bright morning sun hit her face, temporarily blinding her. She did not stop walking. She did not look back at the towering glass building. She walked with a steady, rhythmic pace. Her posture was completely straight. Her shoulders, which had been tight with fear for days, finally dropped. She did not feel exhausted anymore. She felt incredibly, wonderfully light. Harrison Vance was not a god. He was just a liar, a desperate, cornered liar whose perfectly constructed world had just shattered into a million sharp pieces on a doctor's mahogany desk. Clara walked 2 blocks down the busy avenue. She stopped in front of a small, crowded, independent coffee shop. She pulled open the wooden door. The little brass bell above it chimed brightly. The air inside was entirely different from the sterile, lavender-scented clinic. It was thick with the sharp, bitter smell of deeply roasted espresso beans. The loud hiss of a milk steamer drowned out the low murmur of conversation. It smelled like normal life. It smelled like the real world. Clara stepped up to the counter. The young barista smiled at her. "What can I get for you?" the barista asked. "A large decaf iced coffee, please," Clara said. The barista tapped the order into the screen. "And a name for the order." Clara paused. For 4 years, she had given the same name, Vance, a name that opened doors, commanded respect, and slowly erased her entirely. She took a deep breath. "Davis," Clara said clearly. The barista scribbled the name on a plastic cup with a black marker. "All right, Davis. It will be right out." Clara stepped to the side. She waited near the pick-up counter. She watched the condensation slowly form on the outside of the cold milk jugs. She listened to the rhythmic thumping of the portafilter against the metal trash bin. 5 minutes passed. "Large decaf iced coffee for Davis," the barista called out. Clara stepped forward. She wrapped her hand around the freezing plastic cup. A tiny sudden jolt of electricity ran up her arm. It shot straight into her chest. It was a completely physical reaction, a thrill, a spark of pure, unadulterated reclamation. She was Clara Davis again. She had a name that belonged only to her. She took a sip of the cold coffee. The bitter ice rushed over her tongue. It was perfect. Clara walked to a small wooden table by the front window. She sat down. She rested her hand gently on her swollen stomach. The baby shifted, a soft, comfortable roll beneath her ribs. "We are going to be just fine," Clara whispered to her daughter. "We do not need him. We never really did." She watched the people rushing past on the sidewalk outside. She imagined what was happening back in the doctor's office. Harrison, screaming at his security team. Harrison, frantically dialing his lawyers. Harrison, realizing that the massive, expensive trap he had set for his wife had just locked securely around his own ankle. A 3-year-old son, the words echoed in her mind. Harrison had a child, a little boy who was sick, a little boy who required expensive, specialized medical care. That was why the $15,000 vanished every single month to Apex Logistics. It was not just an affair, it was an entirely hidden family. And Harrison had tried to destroy Clara, tried to rip away her reputation and her sanity, just to make sure she never looked closely enough to find them. Suddenly, her phone vibrated violently against the wooden table. Not the cheap plastic burner phone, her actual phone, the one with the cracked screen. Clara looked down. The caller ID displayed a name she had not seen in days: Jillian Hayes, the 28-year-old executive assistant, the registered owner of the shell company, the mother of the secret child. Clara stared at the glowing screen. She felt a brief, dark flash of anger. This was the woman who smiled in her face while sleeping with her husband. This was the woman cashing the checks. But then, Clara remembered the sheer terror in Evelyn Vance's eyes yesterday. She remembered the absolute ruthlessness of Harrison's legal threats. If Harrison treated his legal wife like a disposable problem, how exactly did he treat a secret mistress? Clara picked up the phone. She pressed the green button. She held the phone to her ear. She did not say hello. She just waited. A ragged, gasping breath came through the speaker. Clara. Jillian S.'s voice was completely broken. She was sobbing. Heavy, panicked tears that made her choke on the words. "I am here, Jillian," Clara said. Her voice was calm, methodical, completely detached. "He called me." Jillian sobbed. "Harrison just called me from the clinic. He was screaming. Clara, I have never heard him like that. He knows that you know." "Yes," Clara said smoothly. "He knows. The National Registry matched his DNA to your son." A sharp, terrified wail escaped Jillian's throat. The sound was so full of raw, maternal panic that it made Clara sit up straighter in her chair. "He told me to pack a bag," Jillian cried. "He told me he is sending a private car. He said, if I do not take my son and get on a plane to a facility in Switzerland by tonight, he will cut off the medical funding. He will let my baby die." Clara, he swore he would do it. The coffee shop around Clara seemed to fade away. The clinking of mugs and the chatter of customers vanished. There was only the cold, hard reality of Harrison's cruelty. He wasn't just a narcissist. He was a monster willing to sacrifice a sick 3-year-old boy to save his public image. "Jillian," Clara said sharply. Her voice cut right through the younger woman's panic. "Stop crying. Listen to me very carefully." Jillian sniffled loudly. "I do not know what to do. I am so scared of him." "Do not pack a bag," Clara commanded. "Do not get in any car he sends. Do you have physical possession of the financial records for Apex Logistics?" A long silence filled the line. "Yes," Jillian whispered. "I have everything. The bank statements, the medical receipts, the threatening emails he sent me when I asked for more help." "Good," Clara said. Her mind was moving with incredible speed, a tactical map unfolding in her brain. "He thinks he has isolated both of us. He thinks we are too scared to fight back. I am scared," Jillian admitted. her voice trembling. He can ruin us. Clara, not if we ruin him first. Clara stated. It was not a threat. It was a promise. I am going to text you an address. It is a public park on the east side of the city. Bring the documents. Bring everything you have. Will you help me? Jillian pleaded. I know you hate me. I know what I did was wrong. But please, my son. Clara took a slow sip of her cold coffee. She looked out the window at the bright, sunny street. I do not hate you, Jillian, Clara said quietly. We were both played by the exact same man. But the game stops today. Be at the park in 1 hour. Clara ended the call. She placed the phone face down on the table. She was not just fighting for her own divorce settlement anymore. She was holding the key to Harrison Vance's total destruction, and she was going to use it. The heavy gray gravel crunched loudly beneath Clara S. leather boots. The public park on the east side of the city was practically empty at noon on a Tuesday. A sharp, cold wind swept across the open lawn, biting at Clara S. cheeks and pulling at the edges of her maternity coat. The storm from yesterday had left a distinct scent in the air, the rich, heavy smell of wet earth and decaying oak leaves. Clara walked toward a secluded green wooden bench near the edge of the duck pond. She sat down. The wooden slats were cold. She folded her hands over her stomach. She watched the gray water ripple in the wind. She waited. 10 minutes later, a figure appeared on the winding paved path. It was Jillian Hayes. Clara watched the younger woman approach. For the past 3 years, Clara had only seen Jillian inside the pristine glass walls of Harrison S. corporate headquarters. There, Jillian had been a flawless, confident executive assistant. She always wore tailored pencil skirts, silk blouses, and a bright, professional smile. The woman walking down the path right now looked like a completely different person. Jillian was swallowed inside a bulky, oversized tan trench coat. Her shoulders were hunched forward, as if she were trying to make herself physically smaller. She wore large, dark sunglasses that covered half of her face. She was clutching a heavy brown leather satchel tightly against her chest, holding it like a shield. Jillian stopped 5 feet away from the wooden bench. She stood frozen. Sit down, Jillian, Clara said. Her voice was calm. It carried easily over the sound of the whistling wind. Jillian hesitated. Then she stepped forward and sat on the far edge of the bench. She kept as much distance between them as the small piece of furniture would allow. The younger woman reached up with trembling hands and pulled off her sunglasses. Clara felt a sudden, sharp pang of recognition. Jillian's eyes were bloodshot. The skin beneath them was swollen and bruised purple from exhaustion and crying. Clara recognized that exact look. She had seen it in her own bathroom mirror just 24 hours ago. Where is your son? Clara asked quietly. He is with my mother, Jillian whispered. Her voice was raspy, broken from screaming. In a small town 2 hours upstate. Harrison does not know the address. I told my mother to lock the doors and not to answer the phone. Clara nodded slowly. Good. That is exactly what you should do. Jillian stared down at the brown satchel resting on her knees. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the leather strap. He called me from the clinic, Jillian said. her voice shaking violently. He was entirely out of control. He told me the genetic test matched his profile to Benjamin's medical file in the registry. He told me our secret was out. Benjamin, Clara repeated softly. A real name. A real child. What is wrong with him? Jillian. Jillian squeezed her eyes shut. A single tear escaped, rolling down her pale cheek. It is a severe autoimmune disorder, Jillian explained, her voice cracking. He needs specialized infusions every 2 weeks. The treatments are incredibly expensive. Harrison set up the shell company, Apex Logistics, to funnel the money without leaving a personal paper trail. He said he was protecting us. Clara let out a short, humorless laugh. The sound was bitter against the wind. Harrison Vance only protects one thing: himself. How long were you together? Jillian swallowed hard. It started 4 years ago, right after he married you. He was charismatic. He paid attention to me. I was 24 years old. Clara, I was stupid. When I got pregnant, I wanted to keep the baby. Harrison told me he would destroy my life if I ever went public. So you took the money, Clara said. It was not a judgment. It was a simple statement of fact. I had to, Jillian sobbed. When Benjamin got sick, the medical bills were hundreds of thousands of dollars. I could not afford them. Harrison became the savior, but he also became the warden. He held my son's life over my head. Jillian turned to look at Clara. Her eyes were wide, filled with a desperate need to be understood. He told me you were insane, Jillian whispered. The words tumbled out rapidly. He told me you were a jealous, vindictive woman. He said if you ever found out about Benjamin, you would use your family money to tie us up in court. He said you would intentionally cut off my baby's medical funding out of pure spite. Clara stopped breathing for a second. The sheer magnitude of the manipulation was breathtaking. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Harrison had isolated both of them. He had painted Clara as a monster to keep his mistress terrified and compliant. And he had painted himself as the victim to Clara, accusing her of infidelity, to keep her constantly on the defensive. He had built two completely separate prisons out of lies, and he had thrown away both keys. Clara looked at the terrified 28-year-old woman sitting next to her. She did not feel anger toward Jillian anymore. She only felt a profound, heavy sadness for the time they had both lost to a sociopath. He told me you were just an employee, Clara said, her voice remarkably steady. He told you I was a monster. Clara shifted on the wooden bench. She looked directly into Jillian S. bloodshot eyes. We were both played, Clara stated firmly. The words carried the absolute weight of truth. But the game stops today. Jillian let out a long, shuddering breath. The tension in her shoulders finally seemed to break. She unbuckled the heavy leather satchel. She reached inside. She pulled out a thick stack of printed papers, bound tightly with a black binder clip. She placed it on the empty space of the bench between them. Then she reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small, silver computer flash drive. She placed it perfectly on top of the stack of papers. What is this? Clara asked, looking down at the silver drive. Everything, Jillian whispered. Her voice was finally steady. Every bank transfer from his personal accounts into the shell company. Every email he ever sent me, detailing exactly how he was hiding the money from you. And the voicemails. Clara looked up. Voicemails. Jillian nodded slowly. The voicemails where he threatens to stop Benjamin's medical treatments if I do not comply with his demands. They are all on that drive. It is a complete digital record of extortion. The wind picked up, rustling the oak trees above them. A few brown leaves drifted down, landing on the gravel path. Clara reached out. Her hand did not shake. She picked up the silver flash drive. The metal was cold against her warm palm. She dropped it into her purse. Then she picked up the thick stack of papers. You need to disappear for 48 hours, Clara instructed, slipping into a tactical, commanding tone. Do not go back to your apartment. Do not go back to the corporate office. Get in your car. Drive upstate to your mother's house. And stay with Benjamin. What about Harrison? Jillian asked, panic edging back into her voice. He will send people to look for me. Let him look, Clara said. She zipped her purse shut. He is not going to have time to worry about you. By tomorrow morning, my lawyer is going to drop a financial bomb on his desk. Harrison is going to be far too busy trying to save his own empire to hunt you down. Jillian stood up from the bench. She looked down at Clara. For the first time, a tiny glimmer of hope broke through the terror in her eyes. Thank you. Clara, Jillian whispered. I am so incredibly sorry. Go, Clara commanded gently. Take care of your son. Jillian turned around. She pulled her oversized sunglasses back over her eyes. She clutched her empty leather satchel, and she walked quickly down the winding path, disappearing around a bend of tall evergreen trees. Clara sat alone on the bench for a few minutes longer. She listened to the water. She listened to the wind. She felt the heavy, undeniable weight of the evidence sitting inside her purse. She had him. It was over. Harrison had built a fortress of lies, but Clara now held the absolute truth in the palm of her hand. She was going to take the silver flash drive straight to Thomas Reed S. office. They were going to file a motion to freeze Harrison S. personal accounts. They were going to secure the divorce settlement, and she was going to walk away with her daughter and her dignity entirely intact. Clara stood up. She felt stronger than she had in months. She walked back toward the park entrance, her boots crunching rhythmically against the gray gravel. She reached her car. She unlocked the door and climbed into the driver's seat. The leather was freezing cold. She turned the key in the ignition. The heater roared to life. Suddenly, her regular cell phone rang. It was sitting in the center console. The cracked screen lit up the interior of the car. Thomas Reed. Clara smiled. Perfect timing. She reached down and answered the call. Thomas, Clara said brightly, I have something you are going to want to see. I just got the entire financial paper trail for the shell company. Clara, where are you right now? The tone of Thomas Reed S. voice instantly killed the smile on Clara S. face. It was not his usual calm, methodical, chess master voice. It was urgent. It was tight. It was the sound of a lawyer who had just been ambushed. I am in my car, Clara said, her heart suddenly beginning to race. I am at the park. Thomas, what is wrong? A heavy silence filled the phone line. The sound of Thomas taking a deep breath echoed through the speaker. Harrison did not retreat. Thomas said grimly, "We thought the DNA results would force him into a quiet settlement. We were completely wrong." Clara gripped the steering wheel. The leather squeaked under her white knuckles. What did he do? His legal team just bypassed standard procedure, Thomas explained, his voice rushing with sudden intensity. They went straight to a judge 30 minutes ago. They filed an ex parte emergency motion. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The cold air from the heater suddenly felt like ice against her skin. An emergency motion for what? Clara whispered. For custody. Clara, Thomas said. He is seeking full physical and legal custody of your unborn baby the moment she is delivered. He submitted a sworn affidavit claiming you are suffering from severe prenatal psychosis. He told the judge you are completely unstable, that you abandoned the marital home, and that you are in immediate danger to the child. The tiny, mechanical tapping of the stenographer's machine filled the sterile conference room. Tap, tap. The sound was relentless. It echoed against the polished mahogany walls of Thomas Reed's downtown law office. The blinding midday sun cut fiercely through the horizontal window blinds, casting sharp, rigid shadows across the massive conference table. Clara sat perfectly still. She was 32 years old, heavily pregnant, and completely calm. She wore a simple, structured navy blue maternity dress. She rested both hands gently over her stomach. The squeak of the heavy leather chairs protested slightly as she adjusted her posture. The room smelled of expensive, dark roast coffee and bitter lemon polish. Directly across the table sat Harrison Vance. He had arrived 10 minutes late, a deliberate, calculated power play. He was flanked by three aggressive corporate litigators in identical gray suits. Harrison wore an arrogant, relaxed smirk. He looked like a man who had already won. He firmly believed his emergency custody motion had broken her spirit. Thomas Reed adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses. He opened a thick, black leather binder. He did not look angry. He looked entirely methodical. "State your name for the record," Thomas said quietly. "Harrison James Vance," the billionaire replied. His tone was dripping with bored condescension. "Mr. Vance," Thomas began, his voice smooth and measured. 48 hours ago, you filed an emergency ex parte motion for full custody of your unborn child. In your sworn affidavit, you claimed my client, Clara Vance, is suffering from severe prenatal psychosis. You claimed she is completely unstable. That is correct, Harrison said casually. He leaned back in his leather chair. It is a tragedy, but my primary concern is the safety of my child. My wife has become entirely detached from reality. She abandoned our home. She is having paranoid delusions. Clara did not flinch. She just watched him. She watched his mouth move. He lied with such effortless grace. Paranoid delusions, Thomas repeated. He turned a page in his binder. The paper rustled loudly. You also recently demanded a mandatory prenatal paternity test. You claimed you had investigators following my client. You accused her of infidelity. My client's suspicions were justified. Harrison's lead lawyer interrupted sharply. As a man of significant wealth, Mr. Vance must protect his estate from fraudulent claims. Let us talk about fraudulent claims, Thomas said. He did not raise his voice. He simply pulled a piece of paper from his binder and slid it across the mahogany table. Exhibit A. Thomas announced, "This is the complete financial ledger for a corporate entity known as Apex Logistics, registered in the state of Delaware." Harrison's confident smirk faltered. Just a fraction of a millimeter, but Clara saw it. The tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. "I have many investments," Harrison stated coldly. "I cannot be expected to remember every single shell corporation." "You will remember this one," Thomas replied. He slid a second piece of paper across the table. "Because the registered owner of this shell company is Jillian Hayes, your 28-year-old executive assistant. And for the past 36 months, exactly $15,000 has been wired from your personal accounts into this entity every single month." The three lawyers sitting next to Harrison suddenly shifted in their seats. The leather squeaked violently. They had not seen this documentation. Harrison had lied to his own legal team. "This is irrelevant to the custody motion," Harrison's lead counsel argued, though his voice lacked its previous bite. "It goes directly to character and credibility." Thomas countered smoothly. Mr. Vance accused his pregnant wife of infidelity to distract from his own long-term affair and to hide the diversion of over $500,000 in marital assets. Harrison leaned forward. His eyes narrowed into dark, dangerous slits. The charm was completely gone. It was a private bonus structure. Harrison hissed. "For an exceptional employee. You are reaching." "Thomas, this proves absolutely nothing about Clara's mental state." Clara felt a profound wave of pity wash over her. He was still trying to play the game. He had no idea the board had already been destroyed. Thomas Reed did not argue. He simply reached into his suit pocket. He pulled out the small, silver flash drive. He placed it gently on the table. It gleamed under the blinding midday sun. "Exhibit C," Thomas said quietly. "Provided voluntarily by Miss Jillian Hayes." The blood instantly drained from Harrison's face. He stared at the silver drive. He looked as if a venomous snake had just been placed on the table. "Miss Hayes has provided a sworn affidavit," Thomas continued, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "She details a 4-year romantic relationship with you. But more importantly, she details the birth of your biological son, Benjamin, a 3-year-old child currently requiring highly specialized, expensive medical care." Harrison opened his mouth. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He looked frantically at his lead counsel, but the lawyer was staring at the documents on the table in complete shock. "The $15,000 a month was not a bonus," Thomas stated. "It was extortion. You forced Miss Hayes to keep your child a secret to protect your public image. You threatened to cut off a dying child's medical funding if she ever exposed you." That is a lie, Harrison gasped. His voice cracked. It was high and panicked. She is a disgruntled employee. She is lying. Let us find out, Thomas said. He reached over and plugged the silver drive into the laptop sitting on the table. He clicked the mouse once. A click, a hum of static, and then a voice filled the conference room. Harrison S. voice. You listen to me. Jillian. The recorded voice spat through the laptop speakers. It was vicious, cruel. You do not call my house. You do not ask for more money. You take the 15,000 and you keep your mouth shut. If you breathe a word of this to the press or to Clara, I will freeze the accounts. I will let the hospital discharge Benjamin tomorrow. Do you understand me? I will let him die. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute. The stenographer's hands hovered, frozen over her machine. The monster was finally in the light. Harrison sat completely paralyzed. His chest heaved. The perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked like it belonged to a much larger man. He was shrinking before their very eyes. Mr. Vance, Thomas said softly, you submitted a sworn affidavit to a family court judge this morning. You claimed your wife was delusional, but the evidence clearly shows that you are a man who fabricates evidence, hides millions in marital assets, blackmails your own mistress, and threatens the life of a sick toddler to protect your ego. Something inside Harrison completely snapped. The Darvo tactic deny, attack, reverse victim and offender had failed. The logic had failed. The gaslighting had failed. He erupted. Harrison slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany table. The loud bang made the coffee cups rattle. He stood up so violently that his heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. You ungrateful bitch, Harrison screamed. His face was entirely red. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He pointed a trembling, manic finger directly at Clara. I gave you everything. I plucked you out of a mediocre life and made you a queen. You are nothing without me. Nothing. His lawyers frantically grabbed his arms, trying to pull him back. Mr. Vance, sit down immediately. His lead counsel yelled. You are on the record. I do not care about the record, Harrison roared, his voice tearing at the seams. He fought against his own lawyers. I built this empire. I control the money. You think you can take my money. I will bury you. I will drag this divorce out for a decade until you are begging me for scraps in the street. Clara did not flinch. She did not shrink back in her chair. She just looked at him. As Harrison Vance screamed and thrashed against his own legal team, a profound realization washed over Clara. She wasn't afraid. For 4 years, she had tiptoed around this man's moods. She had twisted herself into knots trying to be the perfect, invisible wife. She had believed he was an all-powerful force of nature. But looking at him now, throwing a violent, screaming tantrum in a law office, she saw the absolute truth. He wasn't powerful. He was pathetic. He was just a terrified, deeply broken little boy throwing a tantrum because someone finally took away his toys. She felt completely bored. The spell was broken. Are you finished? Harrison, Clara asked. Her voice was quiet. but it sliced cleanly through the chaos of his screaming. Harrison stopped. He breathed heavily, staring at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. Because I am, Clara said simply. She looked at Thomas Reed. She gave him a small, definitive nod. Thomas closed his thick leather binder. We are adjourning this deposition. Thomas announced to the room, I am sending this transcript, the financial documents, and the audio recording directly to the judge overseeing the emergency custody hearing. Harrison's lead counsel dropped his hands. He looked at Harrison with complete professional disgust. The lawyer knew it was over. You cannot unplay a recording of a man threatening to let his own child die. 3 hours later, Clara stood in the marble hallway of the family courthouse. The afternoon sun was warm, filtering through the high arched windows. She held a paper cup of decaf tea. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom opened. Thomas Reed walked out. His face was relaxed. He offered Clara a small, rare smile. The judge ruled from the bench, Thomas said quietly as he approached her. Clara took a deep breath, and the emergency custody motion was dismissed with extreme prejudice, Thomas explained. Furthermore, based on the evidence of financial extortion and the audio threats, the judge issued an immediate, permanent restraining order against Harrison. He is completely barred from coming within 500 feet of you, or the hospital when you deliver. Clara closed her eyes. The heavy, suffocating weight that she had carried for weeks finally lifted from her shoulders. It evaporated into the warm afternoon air. And the money? Clara asked. The judge froze all of his personal accounts, Thomas said, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. The court has appointed an independent forensic auditor to track every single penny of the marital assets. Harrison is entirely locked out of his own empire. Clara opened her eyes. She looked down at her stomach. She placed her hand over her daughter. We won, Clara whispered. Yes, Clara, Thomas said gently. You won. Clara did not want revenge. She did not want to see Harrison destroyed in the public square. She just wanted her freedom. And now, holding the signed court order, she knew she had it. She had fought the monster in the dark, and she had walked out into the light entirely whole. 6 months later, the wooden floorboards of the new house creaked softly under Clara's bare feet. It was a warm sound, a safe sound. The early morning sun poured through the large bay window in the hallway. It painted the walls in bright, golden squares. Clara stood in the doorway of the nursery. She rested her shoulder against the doorframe. She looked down at the white wooden crib. Her daughter, Maya, was exactly 3 months old. Maya was fast asleep. Her tiny chest rose and fell in a slow, steady, incredibly peaceful rhythm. She had a full head of dark hair and soft, round cheeks. The room smelled of sweet lavender baby lotion and fresh, clean cotton. Clara walked quietly into the room. She leaned over the railing of the crib. She gently placed her hand on Maya's tiny back, just feeling the warmth of her breathing. Maya shifted slightly, let out a tiny, contented sigh, and settled deeper into her mattress. Clara smiled. She kissed her fingertips and pressed them gently to the baby S head. She walked out of the nursery, leaving the door open just a crack so she could hear if Maya woke up. Clara walked down the short hallway of her three-bedroom suburban home. It was a beautiful, modest house. It was not a billionaire-esque mansion. There were no soaring vaulted ceilings. There were no marble kitchen islands, and there was no custom wet bar. But every single thing inside this house was completely, undeniably hers. The divorce had been finalized 2 months ago. The media had a massive field day with the scandal. Harrison Vance, the untouchable real estate king, had been completely exposed on a public stage. The forensic audit ordered by the family court judge had torn through his finances like a hurricane. It uncovered years of hidden assets, illegal offshore transfers, and massive corporate fraud. His empire was heavily fractured. Investors pulled their funding. The board of directors of his own company had forced him to step down as chief executive officer to save their public image. Clara had watched it all happen from a distance. She did not feel a sudden rush of joy at his downfall. She did not feel the need to celebrate his destruction. She just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of relief. He was no longer a towering, terrifying monster holding her life hostage. He was just a small, deeply flawed man dealing with the heavy consequences of his own cruel choices. He was a stranger. Clara reached the kitchen. She picked up her phone from the wooden counter. The screen was pristine, no longer cracked, no longer flooded with panicked notifications. She opened her messages. There was a new text from Jillian Hayes. It was a picture. A little boy with bright blue eyes, wearing a red superhero cape. He was smiling brightly while sitting in a colorful hospital playroom. Benjamin's white blood cell counts are up. The text below the picture read, "The new infusion treatment is working perfectly. We are going home today. Thank you, Clara, for everything." Clara smiled warmly at the screen. She typed back a single red heart. During the brutal divorce settlement, Clara had instructed Thomas Reed to make one absolutely non-negotiable demand. Before any marital assets were divided, a massive, irrevocable medical trust fund had to be established for Benjamin. It was legally locked tight. Harrison could never touch the money. He could never use his son's life as a bargaining chip to control Jillian ever again. Jillian was safe. Clara was safe. They did not talk every day, but they occasionally texted. They were two survivors, forever linked by the fire they had walked through together, moving forward in peace. Clara put the phone down on the counter. She turned to the refrigerator to get the milk for her morning coffee. She opened the heavy silver door. The cold air rushed over her face. She reached past a carton of eggs and a bowl of fresh fruit. Her hand brushed against something hidden in the back corner of the top shelf. She pulled it out. It was a small, heavy glass jar, imported, truffle-infused mustard with a shiny gold foil label, Harrison's absolute favorite. Clara stopped. She stared at the expensive jar resting in the palm of her hand. It must have been packed by mistake during the chaotic, rushed move from the rental apartment. It had been sitting in the back of her fridge for months, entirely unnoticed. For a brief, quiet second, a memory flashed in her mind. A memory of a dinner party 3 years ago. Harrison, coldly berating her in front of their guests because she had forgotten to put this exact mustard on the table. She remembered the hot sting of humiliation. She remembered apologizing profusely, shrinking herself down to make him feel big. 6 months ago, she would have carefully placed the jar back on the shelf. She would have made sure the gold label was facing perfectly forward, just in case he walked into the room. Clara looked at the jar now. It looked completely ridiculous, a silly relic of a fake life. She turned around. She walked over to the stainless steel trash can. She stepped heavily on the pedal. The lid popped open. Clara dropped the heavy glass jar into the trash. It hit the bottom with a loud, satisfying thud. It was a tiny, entirely mundane act of rebellion, but standing in her quiet, sunlit kitchen, it felt absolutely monumental. Clara let the lid fall shut. She walked over to the coffee machine. She pressed the button. The machine hummed to life. The rich, dark scent of roasted espresso beans quickly filled the kitchen, chasing away the last remnants of sleep. She poured the hot coffee into her favorite ceramic mug. She added a generous splash of cold milk. She walked over to the small, round wooden dining table by the window. She sat down. The house was perfectly still. The only sounds were the soft hum of the refrigerator and the gentle chirping of morning birds outside the window glass. Clara wrapped both of her hands around the warm ceramic mug. She took a slow, deep breath. She let the heat seep into her palms. She took a sip of the coffee. It was perfect. She looked out the window at the green trees swaying slightly in the morning breeze. She thought about the journey she had just survived. She thought about the woman she used to be, the terrified woman sitting on the cold bathroom tile, crying over a legal folder, the woman who genuinely believed her life was completely over because a powerful man told her it was. She finally understood the truth, the profound, quiet wisdom that you can only learn by surviving the storm. The prison door had been unlocked all along. She had been her own warden. She had stayed in the cage of her marriage because she thought the time she had invested meant something. She had stayed because the cage was comfortable, and because the man who built it constantly told her she would not survive on the outside. But time spent in a cage does not buy you anything but older bones. She had to lose everything to realize how incredibly strong she actually was. She had to be pushed to the absolute edge of her sanity to learn how to fight back. Harrison Vance had tried to break her, but instead, he had accidentally set her free. He had handed her the very tools she needed to dismantle his empire. He had forced her to find her voice. A soft, happy babble drifted down the hallway from the nursery. Maya was awake. The sound was bright and full of life, a pure, beautiful demand for her mother. Clara smiled. It was not the forced, fragile smile she used to wear for the cameras. It was a real, genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She took one last, long sip of her coffee. She placed the mug gently on the wooden table. She stood up. Her body felt light, strong, ready. Clara walked out of the kitchen. She walked down the hallway, toward the nursery, toward her daughter, toward the beautiful, completely unwritten future waiting for them both. She was whole. She was at peace. She was completely free.
Wow, let's take a deep breath and unpack what we just witnessed. Because the psychological layers in this story are absolutely incredible. At its core, this is a story about the devastating mechanics of gaslighting and narcissistic abuse. Harrison Vance used a textbook manipulation tactic known as Darvo-Denny, attack and reverse victim and offender. By accusing Clara of a fabricated affair, he put her completely on the defensive. He knew that if she was terrified, isolated, and scrambling to prove her own innocence, she would never have the time or the clarity to look into his finances. He weaponized her reality against her. How many times in our own lives have we doubted our truth just because someone else spoke their lies with absolute confidence? Clara's survival began the exact moment she sat on that cold bathroom tile and said out loud, "I am not crazy." That is the moment she took her power back. Furthermore, this story redefines what a golden cage truly is. Clara had the marble kitchen, the expensive clothes, and the billionaire lifestyle. But wealth without autonomy is just beautifully decorated captivity. The story teaches us that true peace doesn't come from a luxury SUV or a massive bank account. It comes from drinking a cheap iced coffee under your own name, knowing that your life belongs entirely to you. Clara lost her luxurious lifestyle, but she gained the most expensive thing in the world, her freedom. And perhaps the most beautiful lesson here is the unexpected alliance between Clara and Gillian. Society and media often pushed the narrative that the wife and the mistress must destroy each other, that women must fight over the toxic man. But Clara realized something profound. They were both just pawns on Harrison's chessboard. Gillian wasn't a villain. She was a desperate, terrified mother being extorted by the same monster. By choosing empathy over ego, Clara didn't just save herself. She saved a sick 3-year-old boy. It's a powerful reminder that when women support each other instead of tearing each other down, they become an unstoppable force. In the end, Clara throwing away that jar of expensive mustard wasn't just about cleaning out a fridge. It was a physical rejection of her past trauma. It showed us that you don't know how incredibly strong you are until being strong is your only choice. No matter how deep the betrayal, no matter how powerful the opponent, your dignity and your truth are weapons no one can ever take away from you unless you hand them over. Clara kept hers, and she won. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that